At a Wednesday evening church meeting, a very wealthy man suddenly rose in the middle of the service and began to give his testimony. "I'm a millionaire," he said, "and I attribute it all to the rich blessings of God in my life." He said, "I can still remember the turning point in my faith like it was yesterday. I had just earned my first dollar and I went to a church meeting that very night. The speaker was a missionary, and he told us all about his important work. And I knew that I only had a single dollar bill, and I had to either give it all to God's work or nothing at all. So at that moment, I decided to give my entire dollar to God. And I believe that God blessed that decision, and that is why I am a rich man today." Well, as he finished, it was clear that everybody in the congregation had been moved by his story. But as he took his seat, a little old lady sitting in the pew behind him leaned over and said, "That was a wonderful story, dear. I dare you to do it again." I guess it's a little harder to be faithful to the Spirit's prompting when you have everything to lose. Today's fruit of the Spirit is the fruit of faithfulness. And I wonder if you've ever had a time in your life where God asked something of you and you had to choose whether you would be faithful to His leading or play it safe, play it comfortable. For me, one of those defining moments came when I switched denominations. I came to faith at the age of 16 in the Baptist church, and I will forever be grateful to the Baptist church for that gift that they bestowed upon me, the gift of faith. But as I matured and got into my early 20s, and as I was finishing up Bible college and entering seminary, I was getting closer to ordination. I was a pastor in the Baptist church, a church planting pastor. We had founded this little tiny group of 30 people, and we were in a storefront in Oak Ridges and reaching out into the community and growing this little newly planted church. But I had this conviction in my heart that it wasn't where I was meant to be. There were some theological differences. I struggled preaching to women, but not allowing them in leadership, for example. In this particular denomination, the specific Baptist church, they didn't allow women in leadership. There are a few other things. But moreover, the most important thing was I just felt that I was being called somewhere else. And so, even though I had been building a career in the Baptist church, even though I had many contacts and I was doing quite well, and even though I was nearing the end of my education journey, foolishly, or perhaps faithfully, I followed the Lord to the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that the PCC is perfect by any means, and I'm not even saying that we're better than the tradition I left. But I knew that it was where I was being called, and so I had to follow. The road to the PCC wasn't an easy one. I ended up doing 11 years of post-secondary education, which is why I have 4 plaques in my office on the wall. Well, 3. I didn't frame the last one. They're really expensive. But it was worth it because while the road was long and windy and quite frankly expensive, it led me to where I'm standing right here today. I've learned over the last 30 years of ministry that even when the road is tough, and it will sometimes be tough, if you faithfully follow the leading of God, step by step, inch by inch, you will end up exactly where you need to be. The key is to be faithful. Day by day, be faithful. Now let's talk about that word faithfulness for a moment. I suspect that faithfulness might be a little harder to wrap your head around than love or joy or kindness, but Paul created this list of 9 fruits of the Spirit, which means he really thought things out. This is not a random list. This is the result of a lot of theological reflection, and he quite intentionally chose to include faithfulness. So what is faithfulness? To whom or what are we to be faithful? Why is it important to be faithful? And what exactly does faithfulness look like? So let's break this down a little bit. First of all, faithfulness begins with faith. In the Bible, the Greek word that we usually use for faithfulness is the Greek word pistis, which can mean either faith or faithfulness. And the only real way to tell which word you're supposed to use is context. Context is how you decide which word to use, and sometimes both can apply equally. Not only are these two words related, but the two concepts are related. You see, it's impossible to have faith without faithfulness, and it's impossible to be faithful without faith. Now, this is a concept that can be found through the entire Bible. I think one of the most dramatic examples is found in Genesis 22. Just a few weeks ago, our Muslim friends celebrated the festival of Eid al-Adha. This is often referred to as the Big Eid or the Greater Eid. Eid al-Adha is an Islamic holiday that honors Abraham's devotion and obedience to Allah. In Arabic, Eid al-Adha translates to the festival of sacrifice. And this holiday specifically commemorates Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Ishmael when commanded by Allah. And if this sounds familiar to you, that's because it is. It's one of the most famous stories that is central to 3 of the world's major religions. And if you turn to your Pew Bible, you'll find it in Genesis chapter 22. Here's how the story goes. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. And God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love." That's important. Whom you love. Your only son, whom you love, Isaac, go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Now, how is it that Abraham could obey such a command? How? Have you ever had a time in your life when God asked you to do something that just didn't make any sense? None whatsoever. I have a friend named Sarah. And Sarah was a teacher. And if you're a teacher, you have a goal in mind, and that goal is retirement. Any teachers here? Can I get an amen? Well, you know what? The teachers have a fairly decent pension, and it's tough work, and if you put in a certain amount of time, you get to that golden number, you can retire and maybe do something else or enjoy your retirement, whatever it is. My friend Sarah was about 12, 15 years from that. She was younger, but she saw it coming. She put in the work. She was doing well. She knew what she was doing. She was well respected. And then God got involved. God said, you know what? I don't think you need that pension. And I don't think you need this career. You've been useful and you've been helpful and you've impacted people's lives, but I have something else for you. He said, I want you to become a therapist. So she spoke with her family. She went back to school. She quit her job. And she started a little tiny practice just off her living room in a little space in her house. And when I met Sarah, I met her because she was my therapist. And I met with her in a facility with many, many offices, with many staff that she oversaw. And God had a plan for her life. It was scary, and there were sacrifices to be made, but God had his hand upon it. She had no idea in the world if it would ever work out, but faithfully she followed step by step, day by day, course by course, till God brought her exactly to where she needed to be. I wouldn't be surprised if many of you have experienced times in your life where you needed to leave the security of the known to set out into the unknown. And sometimes you just know that it is the leading of God. Well, getting back to our story, Abraham, he didn't have to guess because God spoke directly to him. Must be nice, right? Except the thing that God was asking was a terrible thing. He knew this was a leading from God, but it was a really tough ask, and that's to put it mildly. How could he do this? How could any of us, for that matter, follow God into the unknown, especially if it's a really big ask? Well, the answer to that is faith. Your trust in the character of God. Faithfulness begins with faith, faith in who God is. Faith that God wouldn't ask something of you that wasn't ultimately going to lead you to exactly where you needed to be. You see, faithfulness isn't just an internal conviction. And faith isn't necessarily just assent to a certain theological dogma. Faithfulness is what happens when we move from ideology to action. Abraham and Isaac demonstrate putting faith into action perhaps more than almost any other story in the Bible. Here's what happens where we pick it up. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged wood on it. He bound his son Isaac, and he laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. And then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. Abraham could talk about his faith all day long, but in that moment, Abraham really knew how far he was willing to go. And yes, this is a disturbing image, and it leaves us more than a little unsettled. If it doesn't, you might want to see Sarah, my therapist friend. But isn't that the point? Isn't the whole point of faithfulness trusting in God's leading even when nothing seems to make sense? Otherwise, it wouldn't be called faithfulness, it would be called ordinariness. You see, here's the thing that you need to know about this passage. Many other gods in Abraham's day demanded human sacrifice. What we find extremely horrifying was for many ordinary operating procedure. In fact, while it disturbs us to think about God demanding sacrifice to Abraham, this may not have been so shocking. But what is shocking, the plot twist, if you will, is that God stays Abraham's blade. The angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied once again. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Now this is far from ordinary. God is teaching Abraham about who he is and what pleases him. And it is not human sacrifice that pleases Yahweh. It is trust in who God is that is most important to him. Another word for that is faith. And living that out is faithfulness. And this is the moment where Israelite religion begins to take a turn and diverge sharply from other Canaanite and Assyrian and Egyptian religions that taught that blood was required to appease the gods. The prophet Hosea would go on to proclaim God's true desire. "I want you to show love, not offer sacrifices. I want you to know me more than I want burnt offerings." Which is why the story ends very differently than the way it begins. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over, he took the ram, sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Some 2,000 years later, the world still didn't get it. They were still trying to appease God in all the wrong ways. Whether it was through human sacrifice, the sex cults, the prophets of Baal who would cut themselves to try and get their God's attention, or even the Hebrew temple system of sacrifice that Jesus cleansed, calling it a den of robbers. The Son of God entered into a world that hadn't yet figured out one simple yet astounding and life-changing fact about God: that He already loves us. You don't need to do anything. He already loves you. And I know this because Jesus, without any protest, much like Isaac before him, was led like a lamb to the slaughter. But this time, the Son was slain, not by his Father's hand, but by ours, offered up to the gods of greed and power and ordinariness. He took our place like the ram caught in the thicket, not to appease the anger of God, but to appease the anger of man and to show the world just how far God was willing to go to save us from ourselves. You know, it's easy, dear friends, to sacrifice it all when you have very little to lose. It's just $1. I can earn that back tomorrow. But you know, Jesus had everything to lose. And he was willing to sacrifice everything, even his life, out of love. And that, dear church, is why I have faith. And that, dear church, is why I desire to be faithful day by day. Not because I believe it will somehow earn me points in heaven or to cause God to love me a little bit more, but because I love him. And I trust him and who he is with my life. Here's a truth worth remembering, that we are faithful because he is faithful. We've gone back to the beginning. It's okay. We are faithful because he is faithful. And I know that the path may be long and twisty and sometimes even expensive, but it will always bring you to where you need to be. And how could we not trust our lives in the hands of the one who gave his